Hi, and welcome. I'm Dr. Shannon Bowen of the University of South Carolina. I'm going to provide a brief overview on some new research in the ethics of employee communication and the ethics of dealing with crisis, such as a global pandemic. First, I would like to thank the Global Alliance for inviting me to be a part of this Learning Month. I'm very excited to share my research findings with you. And at the end of the slides, I'll provide some references so you can do a little more research and find the studies that I'm referring to if you would like. So thinking about ethics in terms of employee communication, we've seen a lot of focus on listening, and listening during the crisis of the pandemic has been a challenge because we have remote work. We have a lot of people dealing with childcare, dealing with ailing relatives, as well as being sick themselves. So how do organizations listen best? We think that listening with moral sensitivity and empathy are the things that will help through this pandemic crisis. And a co-author and I, Marlene Neal at Baylor University, have a grant to study these things from the Page Center at Penn State University. So we have several papers on these topics. We're rotating authorship based on the topics, and I'm going to give you a little more insight into the ethical questions that I've been addressing. Barriers to communication are very important, and in internal communication, the barriers can be all kinds. Fear of reprisals, for example, fear of being candid. Now we also have remote work and the constraints of Zoom fatigue as part of the pandemic environment. I think these challenges are something that internal communicators will work to address for many years to come. Another issue that poses a barrier, and this was really surprising to me as someone who does issues management and ethics, is that we often look to our employees to give us information, to give us feedback, to identify problems in the organization. But the surprising part in terms of ethics is that we might not be getting the candor that we need to do our jobs effectively. So in our study, we asked respondents who were across varied types of organizations, management and non-management, how often do you keep quiet about a flaw, problem, concern, or brewing issue in this organization because you don't want to be the person to deliver bad news? So on this scale, a 1 to 5 Likert scale, 25% said sometimes, 21.7% said half the time approximately, and 25, almost 26% said most of the time. So adding these numbers together, we have roughly 72% of respondents in a 300-person survey who said that they keep quiet about problems in the organization because they fear bringing bad news or they don't want to be seen as a complainer. We did some qualitative research to find out a little bit more about why that was, and essentially we found that there are some more barriers to communication. That listening has to be authentic in order to be ethical, meaning the organization has to genuinely listen with an open perspective and a willingness to take what it hears into account. So you can't do employee surveys and then not act on those surveys. The survey itself may create an incentive for employees to participate because they think, oh, if I give my opinion, something may change, things may get better. We can have less lengthy Zoom meetings and more frequent small ones, for example. But if management doesn't act upon that feedback, if nothing is done to address the feedback, a self-fulfilling prophecy ensues in which employees don't feel heard. And when they don't feel heard, they don't want to talk. They don't want to contribute. So for an organization, we call this pseudo-listening or faux listening. The moral and ethical approach is to listen with an open perspective so that the organization can actually change, can take into account the opinions of others when that information is provided. Another example from this survey of something that was really concerning was that employees said my organization is open to criticism by people like me infrequently. So that was a 2.99 for non-managers. They really don't feel like the organization is open for criticism, like they just don't want to hear it. And even in the manager ranks, we're only getting about 3.91 who said that the organization was open to criticism. So that really gives you an indication that we need to be more flexible and responsive listeners. We need to be more morally sensitive and empathetic during pandemic times. And I mentioned crisis communication as well. Some new research on crisis communication, not a part of the grant that I was just discussing, but already published, gives us an indication that we need to approach ethical problem solving for a crisis from an objective third perspective. So not as an advocate of our employer or our client who we're trying to help solve the crisis, and not as an advocate of groups outside the organization or potentially those affected by the crisis. Only as an advocate for an objective, factual, third standpoint where you seek to be morally autonomous. So you stand outside of the organization and outside of the crisis publics, and you try to determine what's the best course of action when you're talking about how to resolve this crisis using a third perspective, the trianalytic perspective, where you're really relying on a moral analysis and you're doing it from that third point of vantage, meaning that you're trying to be as objective and rational as possible. So that's the Bowen and Coombs research, and we're still collecting data on that, but we have published the book chapter that I will provide a reference for here at the bottom. In essence, we find that employee communication during a pandemic, during a crisis, during challenging times needs to be ethical, empathetic, morally sensitive. You need to listen openly and authentically. You need to respond to the concerns of employees, not just hear the concerns, but actually respond verbally and to take action steps on those points of concern. And then you need to consider from a rational, trianalytic, or morally autonomous perspective how to best approach the problem. And that can help you in your employee communications, even during these difficult pandemic times. I hope that my research has been interesting, and I would be happy to hear from you and answer questions. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.